Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Design Day talk for Super Studio 2024. I will just do a very quick introduction. Sorry, something just happened there. I'll do a very quick introduction to our two Design Day speakers, Alison Cunningham and Michelle Cramer, both from GHD. Alison Cunningham is a highly regarded housing and social infrastructure executive leader with deep expertise in housing strategy, delivery, and operational management. She brings us extensive public sector leadership experience in housing, transport, emergency management portfolios, and is complemented by the NGO leadership credentials through designing and delivering groundbreaking housing strategy, which is obviously very relevant for our brief. And Michelle Cramer is GHD's Future Communities leader in Australia. She's passionate about putting people first when creating connective, productive, and resilient inspired communities. Michelle is an architect, urban designer, and urban development leader. She's a graduate of both Sydney University and Harvard University, and was a recipient of the Fulbright and Knox scholarships. And recently has been awarded the 2024 Property Council of Australia Pathfinder Award. So welcome me in bringing to you Alison and Michelle for the Design Day Speak for 2024. I'll hand it off to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you for having us. I'm going to kick things off and hand over to Alison pretty quickly, but as the architect on this call, my job is to say to you all, keep going. The submission date is very soon, and I know what it feels like to have deadlines of the kind that you have. Our intention today is to bring a bit of world view, I suppose, to how what you're doing in studio can actually be translated into real live examples that we certainly are tackling in our world at GHD. My role at GHD is around looking into 5 years and 10 years and where important issues are going to drive design solutions. So the topic that you are investigating is absolutely perfect in terms of what is going to be relevant for industry going forward. So with that, I'll hand over to Alison to get us started.
Thank you, Michelle. Lovely to sort of e-meet all of you or Zoom meet all of you. Looking forward to an interesting discussion this afternoon, and of course, wishing you all the best of luck with your proposals. So I'd like to just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and we talk today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I come to you today on Gadigal land here in inner city Sydney, but I know that many of you come to us from across Australia. At GHD, and I know that all of us will share this, that we respect that the traditional owners have taken care and nurtured our lands and waterways and skies across Australia for thousands of years. They've established homes and communities on those lands, and we draw on their wisdom and their knowledge to understand and to work in harmony with the climate, the geography, and the weather as we look at how we can build sustainable and adaptable housing. We have much to learn and much to respect from our traditional elders. So I'd like to start by just taking us back to the purpose of housing. Traditionally, of course, housing has provided us shelter from the elements, provided us comfort, a place to sleep, to eat, to connect with family, security, safety from the modern day equivalents of wild beasts, and privacy, a safe space away from the hurly-burly of the outside world, the expectations and the impacts of the people around us, where we can recharge. In recent years, though, our home has also become our workspace, our school or university, our social hub as we connect with others from the comfort of our lounge rooms, and, especially since COVID, a place where we are to stay in seclusion when we are sick or infectious and recover. So over those years, and particularly over the last 5 years, our work and our personal lives have blurred. We used to say we were going to work or what we do when we came home from work. At best now, we might be lucky enough to shut the door of the home office at the end of the day. Rather than going out, we might have virtual drinks or Zoom calls with friends or Zoom sessions like this. Or we might catch up on the socials as a way of finding out what our friends are up to, rather than catching up at the pub or over dinner. So as our homes take on these extra roles, our expectations and what we value in our homes have changed. Those of us, for example, who have valued the short commute from our inner city apartments now envy those in the burbs with their spare bedrooms and home offices and gardens. My love for my quirky open plan little apartment in inner city Sydney in an old school turned to frustration during lockdowns when my daughter and I were both doing Teams meetings at home in the one open space. So if this is the change we've seen in 5 years, what can we expect to see in, say, 30 years? And how do we design for the future, not just for now? So your challenge over this past week has been to design an innovative, resilient, and adaptable solution to safely and quickly accommodate 100 people for at least 6 months, and they people whose homes have been destroyed due to an extreme weather event. So actually, you're not just designing for extreme weather events and climate resilience. The housing you're designing has to meet all of those requirements that I've just talked about for a contemporary home for those 100 people for at least half a year. And if we care and put into practice our values around sustainability, adaptability, and making the best use of limited resources, why wouldn't we design it to last 20 or 30 years rather than 6 months? And if that's the case, what do we need to design for? So I know that you have done lots of thinking about climate resilient homes. I'm sure that's been a big focus for you. Michelle and I are not going to talk too much about that. We're actually going to talk about some of the other functional and emotional requirements that you might want to consider when you're looking at building your sustainable, resilient, and adaptable homes. To help us all do that, we're going to fast forward 30 years. So imagine it is now 2055. How old will you be? What kind of lifestyle might you be enjoying, or would you like to be enjoying? And what will you need from your home to accommodate that lifestyle? So take a moment to think about where you'll be in 2055. And if you're not driving, operating machinery, or doing anything that is unsafe to so do, maybe shut your eyes and we'll pause for a moment and try and pitch yourself forward to where you will be in around 30 years' time and the kind of home that you will need to accommodate your needs and those of the people that you live with. And when you're ready, feel free to pop some ideas into the chat. So on the screen, I've just popped up some of those key functions that we've talked about that housing fulfills, from its most traditional, when it was a shelter from the elements, from wild animals and other hazards, through to social connections, study centres, rehabilitation and convalescence. What are some of the words for you that describe your lifestyle? And when you're ready, pop some thoughts into the chat. Whilst you're thinking about that, though, I'm going to throw in some thoughts about where Michelle and I might be in 2055. You may be surprised to know that we will be in our 80s and hopefully living our best lives. In 2055, we will be loving the fact that ageism has now been reversed. 80 is the new 20, and we've both just finished shooting our second Vogue cover story. My granddaughter is now dating someone who identifies as artificial, so much less emotional baggage than humans, she tells me. I am shuttling between my Sydney co-living community and its satellite Byron Bay tiny home development, reassured that my chosen airline's battery-powered fleet is doing no harm to the environment. Anything else you want to throw in, Michelle, about where you might be living your best life?
I'm excited to be back online, Alison. Thank you. I am in a place where technology is never a problem.
Fantastic. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing, eh? So hopefully you're starting to think of some things. I can see a few things in there, a view of the landscape. It's a beautiful thought. But keep thinking about the kind of home that you will want to be creating for yourself. And I'm just going to talk a little bit now about what the futurists tell us about how we'll be living. A big thank you to ChatGPT for assisting me in understanding the world of the futurist. So Australia in 2055 will be a dynamic and a diverse nation. We'll be leveraging technological advancements and sustainable practices to create a better quality of life for those around us and ourselves. What does that mean about the world of 2055? Well, more of us will be living in towns and cities. Remote work will be more common, with virtual reality, augmented reality, making our collaboration seamless. Our leisure experiences might involve immersive VR experiences, from virtual travel to interactive gaming. Our technology might enable us to better engage within our communities, even if not physically, to connect with neighbours and participate in local initiatives. Education will be more flexible and personalised. Lifelong learning will be encouraged, allowing us to continually update our skills and knowledge from the safety and comfort of our own, the safety and comfort of our own homes. Technology will have made our cities and our homes smarter. Self-driving cars will be the norm, fewer traffic accidents, commuting more efficient, sustainable travel with electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles will dominate, and there may even be advancements in things like personal air travel or hyperloop systems for long-distance commutes. Our homes will likely be equipped with advanced smart systems, managing everything from climate control to security, grocery deliveries. So imagine us waking up at home in the morning that adjusts the temperature to fit the climate outside, brews us a coffee, and starts the day with a personalised news briefing. We're not too far away from that now. Homes and communities will be designed with sustainability in mind. They'll feature renewable energy sources, green roofs, efficient waste management systems, potentially designed in a modular way, built offline rather than on-site. Oops, hang on a minute. Our regional relationships will also continue to develop. Australia will have to navigate complex relationships with regional neighbours, especially China and Indonesia, who are projected to be amongst the world's largest economies in 30 years' time. On the other hand, we may move back in Australia from globalism to building sovereign capacity around water, minerals, and food. So how might that affect the kind of materials that we use to build our homes? And how might that affect our supply chains? We will be part of increasingly diverse and multicultural communities with rich cultural exchange and a variety of social experiences. 30% of us now in Australia are born overseas. 37% are forecast to be born overseas in the next 20 or so years. How will this continue to impact on how we live? Will we start, for example, to see more multi-generational living, as we see particularly in Asian communities? And unless we significantly increase the supply of social and affordable housing, we will probably see a growing subclass of those who are unable to access or sustain market rents, and therefore who live in housing that does not meet their basic needs. What can we do, what can you do as the designers and urban planners of the future to help address that challenge? We will be living longer. Advancements in medical technology will mean that we will lead longer, healthier, active lives. The number of households headed by someone over 75 will more than double between now and 2055. What can we come up with as an alternative to living alone, as many older people do, or living in a retirement village? What are the new ways of co-living that we can create, which allow people to live independently, but also engage socially and get support from others? Our medicine and our health systems will be more personalized. Advances in genomics and biotechnology will enable highly personalized healthcare, where treatments will be tailored to our genetic makeup. So what are the ways that we might actually tailor our housing design to our personal health and mobility needs, and to how those needs adapt to changes over time? When we have a young family, for example, we may have particular needs around our housing. As we get older and our children become independent, we may have a different need. If we're older, if we're single, less well, we might need our housing to accommodate a different type of mobility. How can we build in that flexibility? So I'm just going to pause at this moment, and I'm going to pass over now to Michelle, because as we talk about the housing and the lifestyles of 2055, we're going to now look at what some of the research tells us about the intergenerational expectations for the future.
Thanks, Alison. So as Alison said before, it's not all about the weather, but it's absolutely always all about the people. And so GHD and Future Communities has just done a global research piece of work that is all about understanding what the future sentiment of generations is, and to ensure that we are creating intergenerational equity in the designs that we deliver. Now, I think this is really exciting because other professional areas like law or sustainability have looked at intergenerational equity before, but this is really the first time I'm aware of, anyway, where we're actually thinking about intergenerational expectations in terms of a design brief and what it means in terms of changing the way that we actually design houses and homes in the case of your exercise, and then beyond that to community and to regions and to nations and beyond. So the point of the Crossroads research was to identify preferences, priorities, and multi-generational perspectives across 10,000 people. We used an external research house called Ipsos to do that for us. And we made sure that we were targeting questions to 4 key generational cohorts: baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Gen Z. And as part, sorry, Alison, if you could go back a second. Sorry. We also did that across 10 countries. They happen to be the 10 countries that we operate in, and therefore we had a vested interest in knowing what those people thought. But you can see there are a diversity of countries across Asia Pacific, through the United Arab Emirates, the UK, and North America, and also South America with Chile. So next slide, please. And what we found at a global level, and I think this is interesting given the task that you have around disaster, but there's a clear divide between optimism and pessimism across different countries and also across different generations. So younger generations tend to be more optimistic than older generations, who tend to be more interested in circular economy. Now, we have had a little bit of pushback internally from our own young professionals around that, because when they go to the pub or out to a party or meet up with their friends or whatever they're doing, they feel like they're being quite pessimistic. So because they're thinking about how these challenges can be met and changed going forward. But we actually did the data, we discovered that they're more optimistic than others. And so I personally am interested in how we actually leverage off that optimism to change the way we design for the future. So next slide, please. The top 3 global concerns across all 10 countries was the cost of living, transportation, and the environment. So obviously you are spending most of your time thinking at the moment in the green column around the environmental issues, and also thinking about the cost of living issues, particularly related to affordable housing. Affordable housing came up as the #1 issue in many countries around the world. And I think as designers, that's something we can actually positively contribute to. Things like inflation and the rising cost of basic needs, it's sort of harder for us to have influence over and change the outcome. But something like affordable housing and other types of housing is something we can absolutely lean into. So next slide, please. Oh, this is what I said before, the generational differences. You can see here just outlined that younger people are more focused on affordable housing, and whereas the older generations are looking more towards that circular and sustainable approach. This slide, I think, is really fascinating in terms of breaking down the 4 countries across APAC that we operate in and seeing what the #1 issues were. So comparatively to New Zealand, the Philippines, and Singapore, Australia is a standout. We have the #1 issue being affordable housing options in every generation. And for that reason, we're turning our attention to how we can lean in and actually support those outcomes going forward. So the task that you're doing is absolutely perfect in terms of how we actually manage not just affordable, but resilient housing going forward. The next slide is taken from the census. It's sort of stating the obvious, which is that millennials are taking over boomers, and there's obviously a reason for that. But also we have population growth sitting behind this. So these next cohorts coming through will be bigger than the previous cohorts that we've had, just because of population growth globally. And so that means that that optimism that's present in the younger generations is going to become a groundswell movement, if you like, going forward. So this next section looks at community, and in particular, the idea that housing is the #1 concern for all Australians. The intergenerational report, which comes out of the federal government, says that Australia's population is projected to be around 40 million people by 2060. And that is a huge task for us to manage in all aspects of housing, including resilient and climate resilient housing. Our current population, just as a point of reference, is about 25 million, with 90% of our population living in urban environments. But moving forward, 75% of that growth that we're talking about is going to occur in our 4 biggest cities. And I'm sure most of you on these calls are sitting in some of those cities. It also means that there's a percentage of people, say 10 million, so 25%, you're going to be in less urbanized areas, semi-urban or regional or rural areas. And so that means that urbanization is actually happening in those locations as well, probably with what I would call a lowercase u. And none of this can happen without what we refer to as the housing enabling infrastructure ecosystem that sits around transport, water systems, water security, energy alternatives, health and wellness, education, civic recreation, and so much more. So here are some highlights from the Australian research. And I think what's interesting about this is that there's an obvious statement here that I think everybody feels across all generations, that rising housing costs are pushing Australians to prioritise affordability over proximity. But when we asked them about their preferences, some other things came through. And what I'm curious about here is the idea that that great Australian dream as something that we hold up on a pedestal is starting to shift. There's something in the data that's coming through that's telling us that that's not precisely what everybody would be looking for going forward into the future. So, for example, 63% of Australians believe there's a need for more varied and cheaper housing. So that's not quite the same house on a quarter-acre block. 61% are open to living in communities with a mix of social, government-owned and subsidised housing, as well as traditional housing. And so that means that we can start to get fantastic diverse communities coming together and acting as one community. There's a preparedness to compromise and type and location in order to own your own home. And there's an interesting stat that I heard this morning from Deloitte, which is when you actually hit a city of 6 million people, or an agglomeration of around 6 million people, the desire to own becomes less. And I'm not sure for what countries they're referring to that to, but it is an interesting kind of shift in perspective, that idea that you don't actually have to own your own home. There are other ways of living. And then the last one there is 56% is around willingness to live closer to amenity, but compromising on the type of accommodation you might be in. So it might be smaller, but over a train station and close to a hospital, and people are prepared to do that. What you're going to see in the next couple of slides is really the behind the scenes of where this data is coming from. And what I particularly like about these graphs is that we can see it broken down into the different generations. And in this one, this is, as I referred to before, this shows the distribution around people who are prepared to go for more varied housing typologies. And you can see that it's the younger generations that are more prepared to do that. I think it's interesting around Gen X that the total is prepared to be, sorry, the male cohort is more prepared to shift into varied housing than women. And I think there's a sort of interesting sociological thing going there, possibly about safety and other issues that was beyond the scope of this research study. Boomers are quite happy where they are. And then around housing diversity, we've got this real tick diagram showing that the younger generations are much more preferred, much happier to go to a dwelling type and live in more diverse communities, whereas Generation X are not. And I just reflect on this for a minute. This is tied to the optimism idea, and knowing probably that Alison and I are raising the average age of the people that are on this call significantly. The Generation X are often the leaders of decision makers. And so when you see how pessimistic they are about something like this, particularly in Australia, that's when there's a real call to action to young people to get involved and to help drive that optimism towards different outcomes. And then the last slide here is around that social infrastructure piece, that willingness to live near community. So that compromise on how you live in order to be near things that you want to be close to, like work or schools or hospitals. So that's a little bit of a behind the scenes. What I also wanted to do, and particularly in the context of your task, is also show you some of the data stats that are coming around the infrastructure piece and the housing enabling infrastructure. So this is done globally, and you can see here we've got our different countries across the bottom and different bars telling us different outcomes related to the questions that we asked. So the first one here is around water security, and a few highlights from me. Everyone in Australia, it seems, is trying to use less water. I think we're a water conscious country, which is fantastic. Not as much as Qatar, as you can see. We have a willingness to drink treated or recycled water, but nothing like those in Qatar are prepared to do. And that's probably one of those tipping point moments where we can still get water in other ways. And so our preference is to do that. But if you really can't, then actually shifting to that tipping point of shifting to an alternative becomes the possibility. The next slide is around the energy transition, and you can see we're not doing too badly. And we have an expectation around the fact that we will get to a better place in terms of renewable energy over time. I think it's fascinating that the Philippines is well ahead of us in this. And again, it's that sense of we are an established nation, we have good infrastructure, we can rely a little bit on what we've got, versus a country like the Philippines that as a developing country is genuinely going through change, and that willingness to be actually participatory in that energy transition is coming through in this data, which is fascinating. The next one here is about lifestyle choices and their impact on climate change. So this one makes me, that's not the one I was thinking of. This is where we're looking at, we're not doing too badly in things like recycling and composting. We are actively trying to reduce our water usage, as I said before. And the one that is terrible on this slide is our propensity to lean into public transport. So one of our biggest challenges in Australia is to get people out of their cars and into other forms of public transport. So and you can see the USA is the same in that space. We asked some questions specifically around road safety because that's a particular interest to us, and the rise in zero emission vehicles. And isn't that a horrible statistic about our petrol cars on the far left-hand side? You compare it to somewhere like the Philippines, where there are probably less access to cars by people, but where there is access, there is more of a leveling across the types of vehicles that people are using. And then I think this might be the last one, but the smart technology and digital piece, we're all about intelligent transport network systems, and we're trying to use smart devices to make our lives better. And I think there's some interesting pieces in that in terms of disaster recovery and how we can actually use technology to assist us predict or respond to emergency situations as part of the kit, if you like, that goes with the communities that you folk are designing at the moment. So I'm hoping from these slides, I think is that the last overall one? Yeah. Oh, that is the wrong person's name. Click to the next slide. I'm hoping from this data pack that there are some little gems that you might be able to use when you're thinking about finalizing your designs or how you speak about your designs, and just remembering that it's not just about the design of the dwelling, but it's about the people that use it and the decisions they're making in that process. So if you skip to the next slide, it's our last slide, Alison. That little QR code there gives you access to that data, and you can play with the dashboard that we have. And I've lost the screen here. No, there it is. And have fun with that. And please reach out to us with any questions you might have about that data that's sitting there, and think about how you might use it in your designs. And now we are at Q&A.
Beautiful. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Alison, for that Design Day talk. I'm sure if we were in person, you'd have raucous applause happening right now. As Michelle said, we've opened it up for Q&A. So this is your chance to ask these professionals for some advice right before we close up for your presentations due tomorrow. What we'll do first is, if you have a question, you can just type it in the chat and we'll try to get through them. And then if you do have another type of question, feel free to tap the raise your hand button, and one of our hosts will give you access to ask your question verbally. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. Which is totally fine. Give some time for some typing to occur. And I'll scroll through and just see if we've had any hands raised. Not seeing any questions coming through at the moment.
So do you think that means that everybody's playing with the dashboard, Matt?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe a question for the room then.
Yeah.
Throw some out.
Spin it around.
I mean, you guys have obviously, I'm sure, been beavering away on your presentations and your proposals over the last week, notwithstanding those of you who are playing an all-nighter to update them. Is there anything that we have said that has sparked a new thought in relation to your response to the question? And if so, what might that be? And whilst you're thinking about that, I might ask Matt then. I'll put Matt and Maddie on the spot. Is there anything that leapt out for you when you were thinking about the kind of housing you're going to be designing for 30 years' time? Is there anything as we were talking that you went, that's something I need to really think about in the work I'm doing in your two studios that you're currently working on, say, Matt?
Well, yeah, I suppose for myself, when I'm designing, I am designing for now. So the thought that was provoking was, these structures will hopefully last into the future. That's what we're designing them to be sustainable for. So what future will we be designing for? Yeah, that did take me a bit off guard. I've never had that thought come across before. So yeah, very interesting.
To project yourself into the future and think about whether you're designing for that future, not the here and now.
Exactly. And
I think, Matt, that's going to be, I think that's a shift in design briefs actually going forward, right? That historically, certainly when I went through architecture school in the 20th century, they were very tight briefs around delivering expectations of a museum that's going to be built and located on a river, and a certain environmental context that it has to it. I think what I'm suggesting to industry, so it'll be interesting to see whether it comes back through education systems, is we have to be braver than that in the briefs. So the briefs need to have a longer range and have a bigger expectation about what these design products can do. And we've just had a little eye-opener into what those future generations, which are going to be larger populous numbers going forward, are expecting. And so therefore it changes the way that we write our briefs.
We've had a question come through as well.
I saw that.
One of our participants is asking if you believe emergency housing should prioritize creating homely or perhaps a communal atmosphere for occupants, or should the focus be on rapid construction and optimizing data resilient features?
It's a very binary question.
It's a good one, isn't it? It is a good one. I mean, that's sounding like I'm going to sit on the fence. I think it has to be about both. I mean, if you think about people who've been through trauma, like, say they've lost their homes through flood or bushfire, yes, they need somewhere very quickly to be able to live, particularly if they've got younger family members or older family members. They need a roof over their head, but, they're also dealing with trauma related to the experience they've been through. So they need somewhere that has the safety and the comfort of a home, not just a roof, particularly as we know getting building approvals and getting funding and insurance monies and all those things mean that people could be waiting years before they get to rebuild their homes in Australia. So I think we need to think about both at the same time. We need to think about how can we look at modular housing, for example, or, pre-made, preformed off-site housing that can still be sufficiently adaptable to provide space for communal activities, space for individual activities that you can kind of almost bolt together so that you can actually cover off both sets of needs. Because I'm not sure that I would say that one is necessarily more important than the other.
What I'll add to that is I was very lucky to speak to Professor Pablo Allard earlier this year, and there is actually a podcast recording on the GHD website if anyone's interested in listening to it about this very issue. He had been responsible for rebuilding Chile after the earthquake and tsunami. And what he made very clear is that before you can get to resilience, you need to do recovery. And recovering in a community is about those features that make people still feel like they have a community, that the carpet may have been literally swept away from them, but they still have a way to come together as a group of people and grieve. He said he spent a lot of time talking about how important it is to grieve the loss before you are actually able to be resilient. And I thought that was sort of a fascinating idea. And so, you know, what you're proposing in this question is actually something that we struggle with in real life, in industry every day, which is this expectation to deliver something super fast to solve the problem. But part of the problem is actually a social problem and an emotive problem, not just a physical problem. So to Alison's challenge, how do you bring those two things together? It doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. And I hope that in some way helped the decisions that are going to be made tonight around ahead of putting the finishing touches on projects.
I think the other thought to throw in, just in terms of when I think about emergency housing, because I come from a social housing background, so my first part of my career, I worked with people with quite complex health and psychosocial needs. So for me, emergency housing often means people who are homeless, people who are escaping domestic violence, people who've had episodic mental illness, some of those reasons why they don't have housing and need it in an emergency. And that often tends to be provided as a kind of a single room in a shared building. And if you've been through that kind of trauma, if you've got young children, for example, or school-age kids, they need someone to be able to do their homework, to recover. They need to have the space. Mum needs and dad needs the space to be able to have a bit of their own time, not sharing a room with their kids 24/7. So I think that point that you make, Michelle, about the emotional healing is a really important thing to build in. We tend to sort of focus on the person, the family, the communities in crisis, and they need something quick, but we don't always think about what we need to put around that so that we're not just providing the shelter, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're actually providing some of the other forms of safety and comfort that will help them to survive and get through the trauma they're going through or been through.
It was certainly Chile's biggest lessons learnt, that emotional healing needs to be part of the process, community healing.
I'd be interested if, is it Nguyen? Sorry, apologies if I pronounced your name incorrectly then, Nguyen, but is there any thoughts that you have around what that looks like for your particular project, or any reflections?
I was going to say, I'm not sure if another question has come through, but once you've read through Nguyen's answer, if
Good.
there was...
Excellent.
There you go. Done, yeah.
Really great answer to that question. Guys, that's part of what we were thinking when we were coming up with the brief, was the human reaction to these climate emergencies. I suppose a question for you is, the students are about to submit their presentations are due tomorrow morning. If you were fresh to this brief, if you were to take off your professional hat and think of something super conceptual that didn't necessarily have to get built, how do you think you would have approached the brief as a designer?
I'll let Michelle start that one, because she is a designer.
That's so unfair.
I'm just an enthusiastic amateur.
That's why I thought your answer was going to be more interesting than mine. And do I get the benefit of time, Matt? Am I me back at uni, or am I me now?
You could definitely have the benefit of time.
Excellent. So there is benefit in that. Yes, the me at uni versus the me now would answer the question quite differently, I think. And the spin where I would come to the problem now more is around the people first approach. Like, what is the need and what is the desires and aspirations, and then consider what the design outcome is. So it's that sort of human-centered approach, I guess, rather than a design version approach. That would be the number one thing that I would do. And I would start my presentation tomorrow. If people are standing up or if you're writing words, I would start it around the people, the human side of the expectation of the exercise that then is driving a particular outcome through the design, conceptually through the design, rather than starting with the design itself. Hot tip.
Okay, I do very much agree with that, Michelle. I mean, this is housing for 100 people who you would assume are going to be of a variety of ages, genders, social, cultural backgrounds, religious beliefs, ways of living, who are being housed together for at least 6 months. That's a big challenge in terms of how you accommodate all of those elements. The actual climate resilient stuff is pretty easy in some ways. But how do you actually make something that works for those people, that gives them some communal space, independent space? It's the challenge for me. But I think it comes down to thinking from the perspective of the people who are living there. And I think also thinking about, particularly at the moment when we have a housing crisis in this country, how can we create something that at least has the building blocks for a future community, not just something to be thrown up for 6 months and then torn down? How can we actually make it sufficiently modular, sufficiently adaptable, that in fact it can house those people for 6 months or a year, but then, in the spirit of, I guess, Olympic villages now, it actually can house them for longer. And I think that's the spirit of it, isn't it? That we move away from the disposable into the recyclable, sustainable, adaptable.
Yeah, so I'd also, as part of that, it's be as brave as you possibly can. And yeah, be courageous in your answer. That these are big problems. It's 100 people in your case, but it's actually millions of people that actually need this type of consideration and thinking. Not just here, but around the world. And so with that kind of lens across it, it can widen your view and help being brave in the solutions that you come up with.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
We've had 2 other questions come in, and I'm just going to say we've got about 9 minutes left, so I'll put those questions up to you now. One is very much a part of what we just spoke about. Someone's asked about the healing process, and I think the essence of the question is about how architecture helps as part of the healing process instead of these counselling sessions and sort of human-to-human connection.
I've got a great answer to that, which comes from the Chile example. And I'm happy to share with you, Matt, afterwards the podcast I did with Pablo, because it's so good for exactly this question. But they had a situation where the community that was wiped away was a fishing community. So their industry was gone, their homes were gone, and their children had a fear of the sea. And so the social programs are essential. The question is around more than social. But the programs then had a whole series of physical outcomes that were attached to them that made those social outcomes or social programs able to be enabled. So able to be enabled, there you go. There's a real sentence for the action. But so with this, they needed to get the kids back in the water and to make them feel it was okay to be near the ocean, otherwise people were fleeing. And so they actually created new environments on the coast that included built form structures that actually provided that sense of security and safety back on the edge. And they also then layered on education programs to make people feel comfortable with actually being in their environment, all the while rebuilding the physical infrastructure that was needed for the fishing industry that had been decimated. So they're sort of building these two things at once that were tangible and physical while overlaying the social programs at the same time. So I'll flick you. Pablo says it much better than I do. He's great to listen to. So I will share that link with you, Matt, after this.
Beautiful. Thank you, Michelle.
I think someone's mentioned those things called plants, and I think green spaces are very powerful healing factors. A long time ago, I set up a housing project for people with advanced HIV and AIDS, many of whom had sensory issues as well, and often drug, alcohol and other issues happening. And one of the things that we built in was a garden which had plants that you could touch, smell, eat, that they wouldn't cause you any harm, particularly for people with sensory issues or dementia. So having green spaces built in where people can both experience, feel, smell, touch, and also potentially grow and be very healing. And I think designing spaces that people can have quiet spaces on their own, small conversations, small, close conversations and communal celebration can be powerful. I mean, I think what we know is that people often don't want to receive things like counselling in their actual home. They'd rather actually their home is the haven and they go away for those things. So I think it's about building in spaces that allow people to be nurtured in different ways, and that will depend on the individual. Some people will rather sit and read a book. Some people will love to be able to dig their hands in the earth. I think it's about providing simple variety.
That question has actually come from one of the co-creative directors, Alison, also from GHD. So everyone still listening, take that as a hint. The last question I'll pass on to you before we wrap up is about the balance between other requirements other than basic housing. So if they have an open housing solution providing large rooms, could it backfire in terms of cost and extra space that's being consumed, whether it's homely or if there should be space for public spaces rather than, private spaces for more people in larger families?
Michelle, do you want to kick off? Do you want me to dive in?
I was just, I was actually trying to message Alison Stout at the same time and suggest that she put the podcast in the chat here. If she could do that, that would be amazing, Alison. But also I think the Crossroads presentation, one of the things that I would love for you to take from that is that sense of considered trade-off, right? So we are in a place where we're starting to think differently about not needing the great Australian dream anymore. I know that's not quite related to the project at hand, but what that is talking about is that what we thought was what everybody wanted turns out to be not exactly what everybody wanted. And so people are starting to make different and informed decisions about different things. So one of the things I would always caution as a designer is that you are imposing a thought process on someone else. And in this sort of environment, it's particularly sensitive when you're working with a client one-on-one towards their very clear brief. That's something else. Here you're actually acting on behalf of community, and so working out a way to actually genuinely ask the right questions and be curious about how people would like to be, how they would like to live. Often you get really surprising answers, and certainly one of the most joyful things of my professional career has been around learning from the people that I'm working with about that kind of sense of diversity and difference, and therefore multiplicity of outcomes. So yes, be curious and listen as hard as you can to change your own mindset around the expectation.
I know we're very short in time, so I think
Yes, we are.
Quickly, I would say
Yes.
flexibility. So if you've got large spaces, put in large spaces that you can open up, but also find ways that you can divide them simply. You know, look at living spaces that can add extra bedrooms in, can be reconfigured around doors and those kind of things, so that you can adjust for family size. I think it's got to be that ability to adapt, both adapt for the needs at the time, but also adapt for changes over a lifetime or over different cycles or generations.
Beautiful. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for your generosity in giving us your time today and those very well answered questions. I just wanted to say on behalf of everyone here, thank you again. And to everybody competing tomorrow, good luck. Hopefully we'll keep you up to date. If we can get the link to that podcast, I'll see if I can get Maddie to send it out. I actually think that Alison just put it in the chat. She did. Awesome.
And you're looking for the one where I'm chatting with Pablo Allard.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate you giving up your Tuesday afternoon, evening. And yeah, we'll let you go. But thank you again.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for inviting us, and all the best with your showcases. I'll be really looking forward to seeing some of them after tomorrow. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.